Now, in my last video, I left off with the declaration of war with Spain. It was called that Splendid Little War, which saw approximately 3 months of actual fighting on the island of Cuba and had far-reaching consequences which still reverberate to this day. Now, it was not a foregone conclusion that the U.S. could win a war against a major European power, which Spain was considered at that time. Now, for most people, when you ask them about the Spanish-American War, they will have a blank stare on their face. They don't even know when it happened. However, there are some people who will say, yeah, I remember that. That's the war where this guy Teddy Roosevelt charged up some hill and then we won. Now that is about the extent of the American people's collective knowledge of the Spanish-American War. I really can't blame the people for not knowing any more about it. I mean, it was a little war, but there is a deeper meaning to that phrase, a splendid little war. Okay, so the war with Spain was quick with relatively few casualties. More men died from disease than actual combat. The main fighting on the ground was done in Cuba, the island of Puerto Rico, which was also a Spanish possession and was invaded by the U.S. on the 25th of July, 1898. The island was secured by mid-August. Now, the loss to the U.S. troops in Puerto Rico were about 7 dead. However, the war with Spain did not begin in Cuba. As a matter of fact, the war began halfway around the world in the Philippines at a place called Manila Bay. Now, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, sent a telegram to Commodore George Dewy. He was the commander of the Asiatic Station. Now, that telegram was sent on February 26, 1898, and that was just 11 days after the sinking of the USS Maine. So basically, what did the telegram say? From the Secretary of the Navy to Commander-in-Chief, date February 26, 1898. Subject, assemble the squadron at Hong Kong. Prepare for war. Secret and confidential. Order the squadron, except the monocacy, to Hong Kong, keep full of coal. In the event of a declaration of war with Spain, it will be your duty to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave Asiatic coast, and then offensive operations will begin in the Philippine Islands. Keep the Olympia until further orders. Now, some people will say this cable is proof that Roosevelt's jingoistic attitude purposely escalated the tensions between the United States and Spain. Well, not really. The United States had been preparing for war with a number of countries since the early 1890s. Today it's called wargaming. Roosevelt was implementing a legitimate war plan. But why was Roosevelt sending this cable and not Secretary Long? Well, 10 days after the sinking of the USS Maine, Secretary of the Navy John Long decided he needed a rest, so he took a day off. Now, people say Roosevelt took advantage of Secretary Long's day off and pushed the country closer to war. Okay, the academic debate on that point is ongoing. Now, here's my question. When Long returned to work the following day, he didn't countermand the orders to Dewey that Roosevelt sent. So the question is, did Roosevelt exceed his authority? I would say no. Long could have countermanded Roosevelt's orders, but he didn't. Now, the only thing Secretary Long said about the situation was, the devil seems to have gotten into Teddy yesterday. I like that. All through the month of March, preparations were being made for war. Cablegrams were sent out to redeploy naval vessels. Troops call-ups were issued. Each side was maneuvering to have their forces in position and ready to fight when the war started. Okay, so here's a quick timeline. April 11th, U.S. President McKinley submits his war message to Congress. Congress debates it. Then on April 19th, the U.S. Congress enacts a joint resolution demanding independence for Cuba and giving President McKinley the authorization to declare war if Spain does not yield. Now, this resolution also included the Teller Amendment, which denied the U.S. the right to annex Cuba after the victory and make it an official American policy to promote Cuban democracy and independence. But the U.S. would have huge advantage in trade with Cuba. Now, April 20th, U.S. President McKinley signs the Congressional Joint Resolution into law. On April 21st, President McKinley ordered a blockade of Cuba. The Spanish, in turn, severed diplomatic relations with the United States because they considered that an act of war. On April 23rd, Spain does declare the blockade an act of war under international law and declares war on the United States. So, what do? Well, on the 25th of April, the U.S. Congress declares that a state of war between the U.S. and Spain has existed since April 21st. So it's game on now. Dewey is ready to go. The orders came directly from President McKinley through Secretary Long on April 24th. Proceed at once to Philippine Islands. Commence operations, particularly against the Spanish fleet. You must capture vessels or destroy. Use utmost endeavor. The Battle of Manila Bay was a lopsided victory. In his after-action report, Dewey described how the battle unfolded. It was April 30th, 1898. Arrived off the entrance to Manila Bay in the afternoon. Entered the Boca Grande or South Channel at 11:30 p.m., steaming in column at a distance and at 8 knots. About half the squadron had passed a battery on the south side of the channel and opened fire. None of the shots taking effect. The Boston and McCulloch returned fire. Now the squadron proceeded across the bay at slow speed and arrived off Manila at daybreak and was fired upon at 5:15 a.m. by 3 batteries at Manila and 2 at Cavite, and by the Spanish fleet anchored in an approximate east-west line across the mouth of Bacoor Bay. The squadron then proceeded to attack. The squadron opened fire at 5:41 a.m. and it was at this point that Admiral Dewy gave his famous command, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Now, Gridley was the captain of the flagship Olympia. Now, he continues, maintained a continuous fire at a range varying from 5,000 to 2,000 yards, counter-marching in a line approximately parallel to the Spanish fleet. Now, the enemy's fire was vigorous but generally ineffective. Dewey was decimating the Spanish fleet when he received word, erroneously, that only 15 rounds per gun remained for the 5-inch rapid-fire batteries. Okay, this is probably the worst thing that could happen. So Dewey does the smart thing. He retires from the battle to take stock and redistribute the 5-inch ammunition if necessary. Brilliant idea he came up with. So as not to demoralize his men, Dewey said they were going to take a break for breakfast. Now the report was inaccurate though. What it should have said was each 5-inch gun had only used 15 rounds. So what does Dewey do? He resumes his attack at 11:16 a.m. and by 12:30 p.m. the Spanish fleet was destroyed. The news of Dewey's victory reached the United States by May 2nd. The Washington Star headline stated, "Big victory for Dewey. American admiral utterly destroys the Spanish fleet at Manila." Now, just 6 days after the war with Spain, the United States Navy had ended Spain's colonial rule over the Philippines. And then on June 20th, the cruiser USS Charleston, along with 3 transport ships, arrived off the harbor of Guam, which was a Spanish possession since 1668. Now, the island garrison was unaware that hostilities had broken out between the United States and Spain. The story of the bloodless capture of Guam is interesting, but to retell it would take up too much time, unfortunately. Basically, the cost to the United States to take possession of Spain's colonies in the Pacific, only 20 men were killed in action. Meanwhile, back in the Caribbean, the United States was preparing for the invasion of Cuba. This operation would be a little bit more involved and complicated. So while Dewey was kicking the stuffing out of the Spanish Navy in Manila Harbor, the U.S. Navy was preparing for victory in Cuba. The Navy fired the opening shots of the Cuban campaign. On May 11, 1898, at the Battle of Cardenas Bay, it was a minor naval engagement of the war, and the U.S. fleet was composed of 2 torpedo boats, 2 gunboats, and 1 U.S. revenue cutter. The plan was to enter the Bay of Cardenas and destroy the 3 small Spanish gunboats moored in the harbor. Well, that was the plan anyways. The battle resulted in an American defeat, which caused the U.S. Navy to reconsider further attacks on the port. The cost of this action: Ensign Worth Bagley, the first U.S. naval officer killed in the Spanish-American War, along with 4 sailors. John Barbares, John Daniels, George B. Meek, and E.B. Tunnell were killed in action. The American losses were 5 killed, 3 wounded, 1 torpedo boat disabled, and 1 gunboat disabled. Now, it was not a great battle for the U.S., but the newspapers slanted the defeat as a brave show by the U.S. Navy, which was repulsed by Spanish shore batteries. Now, the same day, on the southern coast of Cuba, at Cienfuegos Bay, the cruiser Marblehead and the gunboat Nashville, armored yacht Eagle, and the revenue cutter Wyndham were laying offshore preparing for action. The captain of the Marblehead had received orders to cut the cable, so he organized a shore party of Blue Jackets and Marines to cut the transatlantic cables, thereby isolating Cuba from the outside world. Interesting fact, the Navy awarded 52 Medals of Honor for that one operation. Now, I've done a video about the cable cutters of Cienfuegos Bay, and the link will be in the description box below. Alright, we're now at May 27th. Admiral Sampson's fleet began the naval blockade of the port of Santiago de Cuba. The Navy began to bombard the port on May 31st and continued until June 9th. Now, after reducing the port and destroying numerous Spanish ships, Admiral Sampson detached a portion of his fleet to go over to Guantanamo Bay and to land a force of 600 U.S. Marines. Now, the Marines landed on June 6th and secured the bay and surrounding areas by June 14th. The last part of the naval landing operation was the landing of the U.S. Army troops at the small port of Daiquiri, Cuba. So, June 22nd, the U.S. invasion force began landing troops at the small port of Daiquiri. It was not a smooth landing. They had to push the horses into the water for them to swim ashore because they didn't have enough barges to bring the horses to shore for the cavalry. Now, this port is located 14 miles east of Santiago de Cuba. The objective was to surround the city of Santiago and the port, defeat the Spanish fleet in the port of Santiago, and force the surrender of the city of Santiago. Now, this began what Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt called his crowded hour. Yes, that's the same Theodore Roosevelt who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy and sent the order to Admiral Dewy to prepare to attack the Spanish fleet in Manila. When the name Teddy Roosevelt in Cuba are mentioned, people will say, "Oh yes, Theodore Roosevelt in San Juan Hill. Didn't he charge up that hill or something?" So how did he get from being Assistant Secretary of the Navy to Lieutenant Colonel, 1st Cavalry Volunteers? Well, he resigned his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He volunteered for the U.S. Army and was given a commission in the U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. Now, since Roosevelt was a man of national prominence, the newspapers gave him plenty of coverage. As far as the American public was concerned, Teddy Roosevelt won the war in Cuba. Yeah, yellow journalism. Well, not really. You see, the yellow journalists had a hand in making Roosevelt a hero and synonymous with the victory over Spain. Okay. The American forces moved from Daiquiri to Las Guasimas, where they encountered Spanish forces on June 24th. Now, after defeating the Spanish, the U.S. troops moved to Kettle Hill. Now, this is where the famous charge of Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders becomes legend. On July 1st, Roosevelt and his troopers charged up Kettle Hill. They captured the heights. Roosevelt then led his troops down the backside of Kettle Hill and charged up San Juan Hill, thereby capturing the heights surrounding Santiago de Cuba. The siege of the city began on July 2nd. The Spanish fleet attempted to break out of Santiago Bay on July 3rd, but were defeated by the U.S. fleet. On July 17th, the Spanish surrendered the city and the island of Cuba to the Americans. 1 week later, the island of Puerto Rico was surrendered to U.S. Now, even though the war with Spain lasted until December 1898, when hostilities officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the actual fighting lasted 16 weeks. Now, this is why Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war. In just 16 weeks, the United States went from a minor military power to an imperial power. The U.S. was now on the world stage, and the major European powers took notice. Okay, so now in the next video I will discuss the U.S. administration of the Philippines and the open door policy in China. Now guys, remember, the easiest way to get an A in any of your classes, just go to class every day, take notes, study those notes every day for 10 minutes. Now, as I've said before, 90% of success is just showing up. So go to class. Okay, I hope you liked this video. Now if you did, ring the bell, hit the like button, and subscribe to my channel. Most importantly, share this video with your friend. And hey, if you have any questions, please email them to me. I'd be more than happy to answer them for you. Anyways, thank you for watching.